Oh, the reception. Yeah. That one I think you got. Oh, yeah.
Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Jenna Burbich, and I'm a program officer at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Welcome to this evening's program, Security, Israeli, Palestinian, and US Regional Strategies. Before I introduce our speakers, please note today's event is on the record and is being live streamed. We always welcome social media engagement, but please silence your phones. The Council is an independent and non-partisan platform, and views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent positions or views of the Council. Thank you also to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you are not yet a member, please consider joining. We have a wide range of levels for you to choose from. Later, we will be taking audience questions from the room and online at chi.cnf.io, and that link should appear on the screens. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening. Chuck Freilich is a senior fellow in the International Security Program at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center and is a former Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel. His latest book, Israeli National Security, a New Strategy for an Era of Change, will be available for sale and signing from our partner, the bookseller. So make sure to grab a copy. Shibley Telhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and is the director of the University of Maryland's Critical Issues Poll. He is a non-resident senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Moderating tonight's discussion is our very own Cecile Scheer. She is a non-resident senior fellow on global security diplomacy at the Council, where she also serves as a special advisor to the Council's Next Generation programs. Ahead of our panel, and to kick off tonight's program, we have a brief flash talk on the results of our 2018 Chicago Council survey, America Engaged, given by, again, our very own Dina Smeltz, a senior fellow in public opinion and foreign policy at the Council. So for now, ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Dina Smeltz. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. In the past year, the Trump administration has shifted American foreign policy toward Israel dramatically, moving the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, withdrawing financial support to the Palestinians, closing down the PLO office in Washington, D.C. But this highly accommodating approach toward Israel is not really in step with American public opinion. What I'm going to talk about tonight is the results of our, sorry, that's not the slide, of our 2018 annual public opinion survey, and it was conducted in July 2018 among more than 2,000 people, and it's very exciting. Okay. It's in a little bit of a different order. So, Okay, we'll start with. Yeah. Okay. I already said this. Okay, so as I said, as we're all waiting for the new administration's proposal for a new peace plan, it's supposed to come out around April 9th after the Israeli elections, Americans think that the United States should really not take a side in the conflict. 62% of Americans say that the United States should not take either side. 31% say take Israel's side, and 4% say Palestinian side. And opinions on this have been fairly stable over time. But underneath this overall opinion, there are some big partisan differences that have arisen recently. In the past, like in the 80s and 90s, the polls on this issue have shown that Republicans and Democrats generally there was a great deal of public consensus on attitudes towards Israel among partisan groups, among different age groups, and that has all changed recently. It has changed as the Republican Party has become more conservative. As Republican Party has become more conservative and their leaders have become more closer to Israel in their attitudes and policies and suggestions, the Republican public has come along. So you notice in 2002, 40% of Republicans said that the United States should take Israel's side in the Middle East conflict, and today that has risen to 59%, which is our highest level that we've ever recorded in our surveys. Now, Democrats tend to say that we shouldn't take either side. So 3/4 of Democrats say we shouldn't take either side, and they have pretty much stayed the same on this issue since we started asking it. Okay, so similar to Republican views on taking Israel's side, Republicans are relatively more likely to support the administration's decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem. 47% of Republicans favor that decision, but the bulk of Americans, including 51% overall, 43% of Republicans, 53% of Democrats, and 56% of independents really haven't heard enough to even comment on the issue. So it's not something they're following closely. And at the same time, we see that views toward the establishment of a Palestinian state have become more partisan over time. Again, look at 1998 and 2002, how close opinions are across the board. But in 2015 and 2018, the more recent times that we have done this, asked this question, 62% of Democrats versus 36% of Republicans now say they support the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Now, there's a couple things to notice in this graph. First of all, 49% overall of all Americans support an independent Palestinian state now. That's the highest level we've ever registered. And where the last graph showed an increase in Republicans becoming more pro-Israel, on this graph we see the increases among Democrats that have really jumped in their support for an independent Palestinian state. Now, this doesn't mean that Democrats are now more anti-Israel. It means that they are growing more critical of current Israeli policy. Our other poll results show that a majority of Republicans and Democrats both say that Israel is important for U.S. national security. Majorities of both have favorable views of Israel. It is higher among Republicans, but still majorities of both. So it's really important to keep that in mind. At the same time that American support for an independent Palestinian state has risen, in Israel and among the Palestinians, actually support has decreased over time. And the researchers who conducted this survey say that is because people in both countries, or the Palestinians and the Israelis, both doubt that it's actually a viable solution and that neither side trusts the other side to actually really deliver on a peace negotiation or a peace agreement. And this has become the most skeptical group in both, among both publics is the young. So where So there are similar demographic differences in Israel and among the Palestinians as well as among Americans. So in our survey, I think the strictest sense of support for an ally is when we ask, would you be willing to send troops to defend that ally? And when it comes to Israel, 53% of Americans overall say that we should send U.S. troops if Israel were attacked by neighbors. And this is 53%, the same as in 2015, but a little bit of a bump from earlier years. Again, there's a big difference between Republicans and Democrats. It's important to keep in mind that Republicans generally are more supportive of the use of force in all of our scenarios. Democrats are at 45%, a little bit of an increase since 41% in 2010. But I think it's, again, really important to remember that as that trend line for support for an independent Palestinian state increased, it doesn't mean that Democratic support for defending Israel has waned at all. In fact, it stayed constant. So I think at that point, thank you for bearing with me with the technical difficulties. Hopefully you were able to see the slides okay. I just wanted to end on the note that many analysts say that the partisan and generational shifts in U.S. politics today suggest related shifts in policies in the future, and we'll see what happens next. But a clear takeaway from the data, I think, is that both Israeli policy, the Trump administration's policies, and Netanyahu's embrace of the Republican Party have all worked together and politicized this issue to new levels. Thank you.
Please welcome Chuck Freilich, Shibley Telhami, and Cecile Scher.
Well, hello. Welcome to Chicago. We ordered this really nice weather for you. This is a little bit of false advertising based on what we've had so far. So we're going to get right at it, since it was a very important topic, very interesting, and open with a question that relates to your book, Chuck. Security in the Middle East, something that Americans care passionately about, no matter what their political stripe, something that affects all of us. Here's your new book, which is going to be for sale over there, and I understand you've graciously agreed to stay behind a little while and sign afterwards. So it's Israeli National Security, a New Strategy for an Era of Change. So what is your view of security in the region?
Okay, before I answer your question, I'd like to take advantage. Everybody knows the elections are coming up in Israel April 9th, and this is an opportunity for me to tell you my favorite joke.
Okay.
And the story is one of the earlier rounds in the elections in Israel during the transition. Outgoing prime minister is about to leave, hasn't quite left yet. The new guy's coming in. And the story is that some guy comes up to the prime minister's residence in Jerusalem and knocks on the front door, and the prime minister's wife answers. And he says, I'd like to see the prime minister, please. And she said, well, he's not really the prime minister. We're in the transition, and in any event, he's not home. Thank you very much, walks away. 15 minutes later, the same guy comes back, knocks on the door. Hi, I'd like to see the prime minister, please. He says, I told you, he's not really the prime minister anymore, and in any event, he's not home. Thank you very much. 15 minutes later, the same guy comes. Hi, I'd like to see the prime minister. He says, tell me, what are you, stupid? Dense? Don't you understand? He's not the prime minister anymore. So, yeah, I understand. It's just so good to hear it. No names, nonpartisan evening, but... You might be surprised to hear that in a country which I guess we could agree has a tad of national security issues, actually no one has ever, certainly not in recent decades, has written a comprehensive study of Israel's national security strategy. And more importantly, actually since Israel was established, no one ever wrote a proposal, which is what the last chapter of the book is, a proposal for a comprehensive Israeli national security strategy. Ben-Gurion once did it partially back in the early 50s, and there was one classified study in 2006. But this was the first public proposal and one of the two really comprehensive ones. And the reason I did it is because I think that there's a great need, certainly in Israel, but in in the United States, particularly in the Jewish community, but not only, the policy community as a whole, for a serious fact-based discussion. Fake news didn't start in the US. Mm-hmm. Now, people who want to scream and shout will do so no matter what I've written. But for people who want to engage in some serious discussion, that's why I wrote this thing. Now, I could spend the next few hours telling you what the findings are, but I'll just mention a few. First of all, I think Israel is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. I think its national security strategy has actually been a resounding success. First of all, Israel exists, which was not a foregone conclusion in the early decades. Far from it. Second of all, Israel has become not just an established state and has been a vibrant democracy for decades, and today enjoys a mid-European standard of living. But I would argue that it has also become a fundamentally secure state. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of trouble out there, and I'll touch on some of the problems in a minute. But fundamentally secure in the sense that I think Israel has won its existence. It cannot be destroyed anymore. There are no existential threats today. Unless Iran goes nuclear, there won't be existential threats, and I believe that we can handle a nuclear Iran if necessary. I very much hope that will never happen. But if it happens, we can handle that as well. And this is a dramatic transformation in Israel's strategic circumstances. Add to the fact that we've now had some decades of a stable peace, both with Jordan and Egypt. And last year, there was a second Sadat-like moment just about, which I don't think got sufficient attention in the West, which was that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the future king, the Crown Prince of the Keeper of the Holy Places, comes out with a statement recognizing Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in the Middle East. And clearly, there are expanding ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, maybe some of the other Arab states. There's no hostile superpower in the Middle East anymore. Russia's a problematic friend of Israel's, but it's a friendly country. Israel has a truly remarkable relationship with the United States, and we'll come back to that afterwards. There have been a whole number of fundamental changes for the better. The Syrian and Iraqi armies, which Israel has been preparing against, those were the threats that the IDF has spent recent decades training and building up for, devastated by their civil wars. I would say actually that the greatest threat that the Arab states pose to Israel today is their weakness, is the fact that they are all states in a state of crisis or soon-to-be crisis, rather than their power, their strength. Now, there's one really big exception to that, not an Arab country, Iran, and of course, Hezbollah and Hamas. And to their credit, I wish I didn't have to give them this credit, but they deserve it. They have reached two really important conclusions. One is, unlike the Arab states in the early decades, they understand that they cannot defeat and destroy Israel, which is their goal, in one or two rounds. And so they've adopted a strategy that I call attrition until destruction. They know it's going to take decades. They're fundamentalist organizations or a state. They believe that they have God on their time, and if it takes decades, that's fine. And I also think that Iran is probably the most sophisticated, most carefully planning of any of Israel's adversaries. And as such, and because it is also a very big country and it's far away, it may be the first country, the first adversary that Israel can't defeat. I think we can handle it. I sleep quite well at night. We can defend ourselves, but I don't know that we can defeat them. So there's a cross between some positive trends and some negative trends. Because I believe that Israel has become a fundamentally secure state, I think that we can take a bit of a deep national breath and take an approach based on strategic patience. And what that means is showing even greater restraint than I believe that Israel has exercised over the decades in the face of endless provocations and these very days, Hezbollah, Hamas. It means placing greater emphasis on deterrence, defense, and diplomacy. It's partly a change in mindset on Israel's part, and it's partly a change in policy. I think that there is just about nothing more important than maintaining the vitality of the relationship with the United States. And maybe I'll conclude with two final points that I discuss in the book. And some of you may say at first glance, what does this have to do with national security? And my answer is it has everything to do with national security. And one is electoral reform, because I think that the Israeli electoral system, on the one hand, is remarkably representative, one of the most representative systems around, but it has also produced some serious dysfunctions and failed decisions in recent decades. Too many, all systems produce failures, too many for my taste. And so we have to change that. And countries are loath to change their electoral systems. Israel already did it once. To do it a second time, went back to the original system. To change a second time is really hard. And the second is, again, as a fundamentally secure country, I believe that we can and must partly refocus our national attentions to where we'd like to place them, which is, of course, on domestic issues, on promoting all the issues that people in other countries are concerned about, improving the educational system and the health system and housing and all of the other issues that Israelis, and especially young Israelis, are particularly interested in, dealing with the issue of Jewish-Arab relations in Israel, dealing with secular Orthodox relations. There are a whole variety of them that have to be dealt with.
Thank you very much. Good tour d'horizon. So, Shibley, what's your view of security in the region, or of what Chuck said, or some combination thereof?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure for me to be here, and it's a pleasure to see Ivo Dalder here, who has been my esteemed colleague both at Maryland and Brookings. And so I'm really happy to see you and happy to be here. And thank you, Chuck. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I haven't read it. Certainly, Chuck is one of the really best experts on Israeli security strategy, and I'm looking forward to learning from his book. Clearly, starting with this one question is done in part because, of course, Chuck has a new book, and so it is good to start with his new book. But of course, this question should not frame our discussion about the Middle East or Arab-Israeli peace or American policy there, because it shouldn't all start and end with Israeli security. Israeli security is extremely important. It's one component, but it most certainly shouldn't be the anchor of a conversation about what we're facing in the Middle East. And so we should put that in perspective. This was not meant to anchor the conversation as much as it is to be responsive to the fact that, congratulations, Chuck, you have a new book. But let me, having started with that book, let me just say a couple of things about what Chuck said and what I have, reviews I have read of the book. I haven't yet read the book itself. So I actually generally agree with it, because I think that it's hard to argue that Israel has not been successful in its security strategy. And it's hard to argue with the fact that the nature of the threat has shifted from conventional military armies to, non-state actors, asymmetrical warfare, and probably missiles and potentially nuclear weapons. Now, that I don't think that's controversial. I think it's just really pretty much conventional wisdom. But what I want to point out here is that if you look at that achievement, which is in part through Israeli, quote, strategy, in part it's anchored in the relationship with the U.S. We will come back to the issue of the U.S. and talk about how that has enabled Israel to be what it is. Israel made the best use of it for sure, and you got to give them credit from their own perspective for using it, that was a big part of it. But also taking into account all the mess in the Arab world, particularly it followed the Arab uprisings and the Iraq war and the devastation that came, and the weakness of the Arab world and the focus on Iran, and all that came out of it, that also helped Israel's security indirectly in some ways, while at the same time undermining it through the rise of non-state actors. But I want to focus a little bit more on what that has done. First, it has undoubtedly given Israel more license to occupy. It's put Israel, I mean, look at the Prime Minister of Israel today, who's running for re-election, who's making the argument that I can have my pie and eat it too. That I can make peace with Saudi Arabia, and I can make peace with the United Arab Emirates, and I can make peace with the rest of the Arab world, and I don't have to really compromise on Palestine. I can do that because they need me more than I need them. They need me for Iran, and we have more common interest, and therefore I have to be less compromising.
Shibley, I'm just going to interrupt you for one moment. Do we have a mic problem?
It might be mine because maybe it's too close.
Yeah, put it on your. There you go.
Yeah,
yes,
okay,
I think it's rubbing on your shirt. I didn't mean to interrupt, but okay, thank you.
No, that's good.
Okay.
So in that sense, it has given Israel license to occupy and really to withstand international pressure, even in pursuit of what the international community considers to be illegal things, such as building Israeli settlements in the West Bank and continue the occupation of Palestinian people after so many years. So in a way, the military, yes, it has made Israel more secure, but it has made Israel more oppressive vis-a-vis the Palestinians, number one. Number two, it has, for whatever reason, it has generated an empowerment of the right, in part because of the license of occupation that has empowered the right in Israel. There are demographic changes that have led to the rise of the right in Israel. It's not all political. It's not all part of policy-oriented. It's the rise of the Haredim, as a percentage of the population, and their activism in politics.
The Haredim or the ultra. And let's just go. We know everyone here has a lot of different backgrounds. We just want to say, when you're speaking of the occupation, you're speaking of the fairly rapid growth of settlements in Palestinian territories.
In the occupied Palestinian territories since 1967, we're talking about an occupation that has lasted since 1967, with no end in sight, with an expansion of Israeli settlements, hundreds of thousands of settlers in the territories occupied by Israel at that time. And we're talking about those, that obviously being opposed by the international community, until recently by every American administration as well. But the international community cited that as essentially illegal. So what I'm saying is, in addition to that, which has in some ways empowered the right in Israel, and has, is still fueling that, it has also reflected itself in domestic Israeli politics. You could argue, in agreement with Chuck, that Israel, to its credit, maintained democracy for many, many years and decades, especially for the Jewish population. And it has done so even during this period of military expansion and war. But what is happening has been an undermining of that democracy, rapid undermining of that democracy, as you could see, especially in the rhetoric and the polling that we have, like the Pew poll that indicated that nearly half Israelis support expelling Arabs from Israel, that you have 79% of Israelis who think Jews should have privileges over non-Jews in Israel, that you have the nation-state law, which recently passed by the Knesset as a basic law, which is equivalent to a constitutional law that gave privilege to Jews over non-Jews. And now you have the Prime Minister of Israel entering into a coalition with the followers of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was the founder of the Jewish Defense League, which Israel itself, whose party, Kach, which was not the current party, but his original party, was deemed terrorist by Israel itself, by the United States and Europe because of as a racist party, and it's being legitimized in the Israeli politics. So what I'm saying is that I am not sure that it's all a function of that being strong and therefore getting the liberty to do what you want to do and feeling have a license to do what you want to do regionally and domestically. But maybe it is a side effect of that.
So, and let's just go back to make sure people understood. The population of Israel is about still, I think, 20% Israeli Arab, both Christians and Muslims, including your family. And then there's also a small number of Russian Christians who have come with their Jewish spouses and things. But primarily what you were talking about was transfer, which was Kahani's original plan of pushing those Arabs out of the country. And of course, the U.S. has always opposed that. So, since we're talking about the U.S., and the U.S. relationship with Israel has been important and close since 1948 when we recognized the new country there. But we've also always, until very recently, prided ourselves on being a somewhat neutral player, someone who could deal with both sides and with as many countries in the region as possible, because I think, Chuck, your point is that it's a big neighborhood, and Israel is looking at a lot of different countries, and the U.S. should be looking at a lot of different countries. But what if you had a magic wand? What would the U.S. policy in the Middle East look like today, whether in Israel, Palestine, or more broadly throughout the Middle East? Because we're in a lot of places there right now.
Before I answer that, I must respond to a couple of the things that Shibley said. Mm-hmm. And I very much hope that this evening will not degenerate into another Israeli-Palestinian spat, of which there have been tens of thousands over the decades. Shibley spoke of the license for occupation. Okay, I am on record as being someone who is dying to see an end to the conflict with the Palestinians and an ardent two-state supporter. I don't think there's any other realistic solution. It's all, if we want, we can go there afterwards. I think any other solution is nonsense. Having said that, there is a problem of occupation, but it stems not just from the occupation, it stems first and foremost from the rejection, which is that the Palestinians have never accepted a single proposal, and Israel has put a number of absolutely dramatic proposals on the table on a number of occasions in which it put everything that the Palestinians were asking for, in essence, with the one exception of the refugee issue. And if after 70 years the Palestinians cannot get themselves to agree on that, to compromise on that, then I hate to say it, but we will never reach a deal, because there is a wall-to-wall consensus in Israel, about 95%, who object to that. So let's put things in perspective. It's not just that Israel has wanted to maintain an occupation. And by the way, this government, the outgoing and possibly the next government, right-wing government, not going to make the concessions necessary. There have been a number of Israeli governments that did want to. There has never been a Palestinian government willing to do so. There has never been a Palestinian peace plan. The settlements are an issue. Let's be frank here. Actually, among the other very difficult issues, it's one of the easier ones to resolve, because when Israel was willing to withdraw from, in essence, 100% of the territory, that in practice resolves the settlements issue. Now, is Israel a perfect democracy? No way. Anybody in this room know of a perfect democracy? Is the United States a perfect democracy? I would argue that the last few years have not been the finest hour of democracy in the world in general. Bibi has said some really ugly things. There's no one in this room who will deplore it more than I will. I seem to remember a president of a certain country finding good things to say about neo-Nazi demonstrators, about Mexicans, about Muslims, about women, about lots of other things. The Prime Minister of Britain is, excuse me, not the prime minister, the head of the opposition, is an out-and-out anti-Semite. Anti-Semitism is rampant in France. Anti-Muslimism is rampant in Holland. This isn't a good time for democracy. The difference is that in democracies, things can change, and they will. And Israel, for its first 40 years, had very moderate governments. And in the last 30, 40 years, in which a lot of them have been less so, there were a few governments. There was Rabin, Peres, Barak, Olmert, who were center, even in Olmert's case, even a left-wing government. And we'll see what happens on April 9th. I will not forecast the results. We'll see. Sooner or later, there'll be a different government. So let's put things, I think, let's be fair about the argument. You asked a question, which had to do with U.S.-Israeli relations. But this relationship, yes, it started in 1948. The United States was the first country to recognize Israel. But the relationship, I think most people today don't remember this, don't realize this. Until the late 60s, really until after the 73 war, it was a very limited relationship. It was politely friendly, but that's about all it was until after 73. And it only turns into the strategic alliance, the so-called special relationship in the 80s and 90s. And it's certainly a special relationship, and from an Israeli point of view, it is certainly a magnificent relationship. And there are some clouds on the horizon. There are. Israel, one of the sources of the strength of American support for Israel is that it was bipartisan. And because of the ongoing, the absence of progress, the absence of a peace process, and the perception, which may be partly true, but it's at best only partly true, that Israel is the side responsible for that, well, that's built up a lot of anger in the United States, and especially on the liberal democratic side. And what I think egregious error that the prime minister made in coming and taking on President Obama in Congress over the Iran nuclear deal certainly added to the partisan atmosphere. By the way, it was legitimate for him to come out against the deal. This was what the state of Israel, virtually everyone in Israel, perceives to be a potentially existential threat. So if there's any deal, any issue on which an Israeli prime minister can allow himself to express disagreement with our #1 ally, this is it. But there's a way to do things. And I think this was a historic error. And it feeds into the ongoing anger over the West Bank issue. Well, I'm hopeful that things may change on April 9th. And if not now, maybe the next elections. And I don't think that the downturn, which is there, especially on the Democratic side, I don't think it's irreversible. I think Israel has to make some changes very soon if we want to make sure that it doesn't become reversible.
So we're going to give Shibley a chance to talk. But when you talk about changing American opinions, the massive growth in the settlements in the last 4 years, going from 300,000 settlers to 600,000 settlers, is...
Those aren't the figures. The figures, if you're including East Jerusalem, then that's the figure. But East Jerusalem is a separate issue, which the Palestinians have also recognized it has to be negotiated separately. And the figure in the rest, or in the West Bank itself, is about 400. And the increase has been almost overwhelmingly in the so-called settlement blocks that the Palestinians also recognize will be part of territorial swaps. The total increase outside of the blocks for the last decade has been about 2,000 people a year. Now, that's not insignificant, but it's not a really big number.
Going back to, like Chuck, I don't want this to deteriorate into who's to blame. That's not the issue. Of course, there was a lot of blame to go around. Just to go back to your main question about the U.S. role. I think that I want to make 2 points on this. One point that has to do with American policy toward Israel, the support, which I think is one reason why Israel has been successful. Not the only reason. You have to give the Israelis a lot of credit for making the best use of American support to advance their interest. But I think one of the things that we should be aware of is not so much the $3 billion plus that Israel gets annually in American aid, which is higher than anything else. I think Israel is now a rich country, and I think Israelis probably could do away with it and still thrive. I don't think that's the big reason why the Israelis are benefiting so much from American support. I think there are essentially two arenas and a third one that is increasing. The first arena is given Israel the technological edge over anyone else, essentially sharing military technology with Israel that no one else in the region has, so that Israel always has dominance, or what we call escalation dominance in war. That is, if they ever get into conflict with anybody else, ultimately Israel will have the upper hand. And that is huge. That is extremely important. That is essential for what Israel has maintained. The second, of course, is the protection of Israel in the UN, which is enabled the U.S. to veto anything meaningful in the Security Council that would have had consequences beyond just passing resolutions that have no consequences. And the only reason why that has happened, if you look at the history of U.S. during the Cold War, since the Cold War, the most vetoes the U.S. has ever employed was over this issue of Israel. And if it weren't there, Israel would be far more vulnerable to pressures, including sanctions and other things related to that in the international community. Those two anchors of American support for Israel have not changed at all. If anything, they've increased over time, despite the variations from, I've advised every single administration, one form or another, from Bush Sr. through Obama. And I could tell you, of course, there have been differences in the way people looked at Israel, sometimes contentious, like with Obama and Netanyahu, or Clinton or Netanyahu for that matter. But the reality of it is that those anchors, those hardcore items, which has given Israel the edge in technology and protecting Israel at the UN, have never wavered. And even in Obama's case, where he refrained from vetoing a resolution during the transition, which was seen to be such a big thing, and in some ways it was, but it wasn't a new resolution. It was really reiteration of UN positions. It wasn't anything particularly new in terms of what the UN had already passed. So those anchors haven't changed. But what has, in addition to that, what we have seen is what the U.S. does with that. Does the U.S. use that to then have suasion with Israel, to be more compromising, or use that essentially to give Israel more license? And I think what we've seen historically is every administration, to varying degrees, said, we need the Israelis to be secure, we will give them everything, we'll protect them at the UN, we'll help them with technology, but we're going to try to pressure them diplomatically to make the necessary compromises. So essentially, there would be tacit, not overt, not we're going to hit you with a hammer, but some form of persuasion to get Israel, to give Israel incentives to negotiate with the Arabs to compromise, as Carter did at Camp David between Israel and Egypt 40 years ago, and as the Bush Senior administration tried to do at Madrid, and as Clinton tried to do, essentially use the persuasion to use that. What we have seen in this administration is something revolutionary, because it's not only that they said we no longer are going to recognize frames of reference like UN resolutions, we're going to start from square one, but we're going to use our muscle to help Israel win. We're going to use our muscle not to persuade Israel to compromise, but to pressure Israel's, the people who are on the other side of the table to compromise more and use our aid, the cutting off aid to Palestinians, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, coercing the Palestinians to see them. And so that is revolutionary. That we have never had, I think, over an issue that's a non-security issue. That is something where if Israel were under threat, I think Americans would come to Israel's aid no matter what. But that is really, I think, revolutionary.
So I think we'll get some more questions about the current administration. I suspect I'm going to channel you a little bit here when I say that, if you were a president watching all the effort that Bill Clinton put into Y and Taba and saw it fall apart when we were so close, as Chuck was saying earlier, the incentive to keep to go back to the table and try to put your all into this one more time would be somewhat limited. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely, and I think the collapse of the negotiations at Camp David in 2000 had a lot to do with what has transpired. Obviously, the Intifada and everything else that emerged, and never recovered from that. And even Obama, who put a lot into it and came in wanting to put something into it, in the end didn't. But let me just say one thing on that. And I don't want to blame the Israelis and Palestinians for everything. I blame our government a little bit, and also blame the strategic picture that shifted. This issue had not been a major priority issue for the United States of America strategically since the end of the Cold War. And that's why Bill Clinton, even though he put a lot of personal effort into it, and we wrote a book on this, as you know, Dan Kurtzer and I and William Quant and Scott Lisinski wrote a book on this. And it is clear, our finding, having interviewed everyone, Clinton never really considered this a national security priority. He was doing it because it was a good thing to do, it's the right thing to do, he had personal reasons to do it. And when you don't have it as a national security priority, you can't fight for it in Congress. You can't fight for it for the American people. The same thing with Obama. Obama went to Congress to pass the Iran nuclear deal. This was a Republican Congress that opposed the Iran nuclear deal. And he got the Iran nuclear deal through because he made it a national security priority. He was able to do it. Neither Clinton nor Obama were prepared to do it or go to bat over this issue like they did on the Iran deal.
Interesting. We're going to have to go to questions now. So if you have a question, wait until we call on you. We will bring a mic to you because we are being live streamed. And I know there's going to be a lot of interest in this topic. So if you could try to keep your question short and end it with a question mark, that would be swell. We have a gentleman right here with his... Oh, wait for the mic, please.
I'm sorry.
No, here it is. Right there you go.
Okay. Do you want me to stand up?
Whatever you'd like, sir.
Okay. When we talk about existential, we connect it typically with Israel. I was born several years before there was an Israel. For me, having a state is the very basic essence of what it means to have security and to talk about existentialism. When I was born, the Palestinians were 65% of the population of what became Israel. It started out 3 decades before that when we were 90% of the population. So it is very much of an existential kind of a problem. I am for having one state for Jews and Palestinians, which is secular, which is democratic. I am also for two-state solution if that doesn't work. So I say that before I ask that question. And the question is, how come the United Nations has not taken up the United States government and the Russian government and taken them to court in The Hague for allowing their citizens to go and settle on lands that are illegal, illegal settlements.
Interesting.
How come our people on both sides do not take up this huge problem now?
Okay, so we're going to merge that into one of the questions that have come in, which are, you've written on the one-state solution. You are now on record as supporting the two-state solution as the only viable way ahead. And this question, what about folks from other countries who are settling in territories that are not Israeli sovereign territory? So, and you can mix those up any way that you would like to.
Just maybe a note, there is the U.S. appeals court just recently decided to take a case or to revive a case that was against American funders of settlers, arguing that this essentially is a genocide because they're expelling Palestinians or.
And this is against Sheldon Adelson.
Sheldon Adelson. Yes. Sheldon Adelson was one of 30 who were named in that, I don't know, I think it was 30, but quite a few Americans, including Sheldon Adelson. Initially, a lower court had actually decided not to take this, rejected it, and then just this week, it was actually taken up. So there's a case in the court related to that, to an aspect of it.
Court cases about lots of things. There have been lots of court cases about Palestinian terrorism. And to even, Shibley, I'm a bit surprised that you invoked the word genocide.
I did not.
You're bringing it as you're giving it as an example.
No.
You're even using it as an argument.
I'm talking about the case. The case invoked the term genocide.
Right. But you're using it as an example to make your case.
I'm not using it as an example. I was just reporting what the case said.
Right, and you chose to report it. Now,
see, this is the thing that, one of the things, Chuck, I mean, and let's talk about this a little bit, because I think this is, a tactic that just doesn't work. It's just like if you're silent, not saying something, then you're to blame. If you say something that you don't like, reporting something,
not at all.
That's not.
You are far too educated.
That's not fair.
No, you are far too educated a person to speak of genocide and what's happening in the West Bank.
I don't speak of genocide about what's happening in the West Bank.
I think we've made our point.
Okay, so
let me say something.
Two-state solution.
I understand where the gentleman was coming from. I'm for a two-state solution because I think Palestinian rights have to be addressed if we wish to see an end to this conflict. Now, my starting point isn't particular concern for Palestinian interests. I'm an Israeli. But it just so happens that enlightened self-interest, if we don't address Palestinian concerns, we can't address Israeli concerns. So let's achieve a solution that achieves everybody's concerns. Now, there has been increased talk in recent years about the one-state solution, as if this is some novel new idea. First of all, it's the Arab position since the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Nothing new about it. Second of all, it sounds wonderful in theory. Let's have one big, great Jewish and Muslim state, and everybody can live together in peace and harmony forever and ever. Well, I suggest that we live in the real world and not in some sort of a dream world, because we know what a one-state solution or a binational state looks like in the Middle East. It happens to be called Syria, and it's called Iraq. If you believe, sir, that after this conflict has been going on for about 120 years, that there's any prospect for a one-state solution, a one democratic solution between Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims in the Middle East, I think you're mistaken. There has to be a way that we can address both sides' aspirations, and that's a two-state solution. And it's time for the Palestinian side. Israel has made some egregious errors here as well. It's time for the Palestinian side to learn to say the word yes. They've never said it.
May I just address the two-state, one-state, not about what the Palestinians and Israelis say. First of all, on the two-state solution, I started supporting it when it wasn't popular, and stayed with it when it became less popular. But here's the thing: if you ask Israelis and Palestinians, I poll not just in the U.S., I do polling also in Israel and the Palestinian areas. And we, of course, measure their attitudes, as you've seen some of other people's polling on this issue that we sometimes coordinate with. When you ask Palestinians and Israelis, while their attitude toward two-state has gone down, that is less than half now support a two-state solution. It used to be a majority consistently supported a two-state solution. But when I ask them, what if there's no two-state solution, what do you think is going to happen? I think a majority agree with Chuck, actually, that only a very small percentage, less than 20%, think there will be a one-state solution. So people are pessimistic. They will say more the status quo will continue as usual, or there will be more violence for years to come. Those are the options, that people don't think that if you don't have two states, it's going to change into one state. But nonetheless, support for one state is increasing, not just in the region, but here. I just released a poll here in the U.S. which showed that now in the U.S., where you used to have a majority supporting a two-state solution, and you've seen before we got to this podium, you've seen some results showing that there's support for a two-state solution in the U.S., for a Palestinian state in the U.S. But if you give them the choice between two-state and one-state, historically, two-state was the winner. What we see now is that they're almost even among Americans. The American public, almost the same number of people supported one state as the two-state. I've been tracing this for a number of years.
And are these
that has been a
people
trend.
who are sophisticated enough to understand what a one-state solution would look like?
I think so, and we also spell it out. But it's important because we have a trend line, meaning people have varying degrees of sophistication, but they're still going to answer it, and it tells you something about popularity when you're tracing the trend line over time. So people are changing their mind; they're becoming far more open to one state. Now, one of the problems for a two-state, and this is one that I grapple with morally, and I think a lot of people grapple with morally, that is, we have advocated, those of us who have advocated two-state, it hasn't happened. And in the meanwhile, occupation continued. And in the meanwhile, settlements expanded. In the meanwhile, Palestinians are still living in miserable lives. And we're justifying that by saying, stay patient because we're going to negotiate a two-state solution. Now, so that this process of the argument of it's a two-state, let's wait for it, may the next government, when it hasn't happened, at some point you have to say, wait a second now, how do we, even if you want to stick with a two-state, let's at least have some measures that doesn't make things worse, or doesn't reverse it, doesn't make it more impossible in the process. So we face a major problem, and I think that in the American body politic, there is a really big moral problem. I think one reason why people almost universally support a two-state solution among American politicians and American elites is that if you don't have a two-state solution, then American politicians are not ready to say that for a one-state solution, because that means that Israel is no longer a Jewish state. And so what do? So it's an escape. It's a moral escape, and we show that by asking a question in American public opinion, which is, if there is no two-state anymore, and the choice is between having Israel as a Jewish state but not fully democratic toward its non-Jewish citizens, or Israel is a democratic state but is no longer a Jewish state, the majority of Americans of every group, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, choose democracy over Jewishness. And for that reason, I think that's a problem. And you can see, even in the American Jewish community, all the struggle that is going on now with the nature of Israel, particularly given the politics that are happening with it.
So I think we're going to have another program here on the single state versus double state solution, and we're going to run out of time. We have time for one more quick question. Oh, my gosh. Sir, you seem really, can you make it super, super brief?
Very brief. How do you see the chaotic Trump administration having long-term negatives to the region? And I like to address the fact that came out today that Mike Flynn was in cahoots with some other actors in selling nuclear capabilities to the Saudis.
Big story today. So look, maybe I'll just add the long-term effect of Trump administration policies on the region at this point.
Well, all right, I'll give you time to think a little bit for the final answer. But let me just say, let me say, I don't really think. I mean, when we use the term policy, we're giving them too much credit.
That was part of my answer.
Yeah, that's really it. And I think the president himself has an instinct. I mean, look at how he does domestic politics. Let's put it this way. foreign policy is hard enough for all of us to understand, those of us who've got our hands in it all over. And I still change my mind quite frequently on some key issues because I'm not sure. And to learn all of that. And we know if our president's policies domestically are not policies, how are we going to expect that there will be policies toward the rest of the world? The only question in my mind, really, in the short term, is whether he cares enough about issues that he doesn't care about personally. He will let advisors run with, and some of them may have policies or attitudes. And if they don't touch on his sensitivity or instincts, maybe the people within the bureaucracy who can push for things. But the biggest issue is going to be Iran. I mean, whether or not we're going to be on a slippery slope toward confrontation with Iran. That is my biggest fear. I don't think the president's instinct is to go to war. Most of what we have learned about him suggests that's not his instinct. But we also know that he's malleable. We know that there are a lot of people in his administration who want to go in that direction. And we know that a lot of foreign actors want to go in that direction. And so that issue really troubles me. And I think the biggest thing I fear from this administration on the Middle East is not what's going to happen in Israel-Palestine. They're going to have to deal with each other, Israelis and Palestinians. They're going to have to deal with each other, with or without Donald Trump. Trust me. And I think I'm not worried about what's going to happen in the Arab world because I don't think in the end America is going to be the one who's going to decide that. America is not going to be, and for that matter, Syria as well. So the only one issue I think that's going to be consequential is what we ultimately end up doing on Iran, and that remains to be an open question.
Thank you. Chuck.
First of all, I would say that as Shibley was saying, first of all, we need an American Mideast policy. Now, I also think that in the course of a 4, potentially 8-year term, that just by the law of averages, the president will get some decisions right. And I think that his decision on Jerusalem was correct. I think it was misapplied or mistimed. In other words, I would have saved it, assuming that there is going to be an American peace initiative, I would have saved it as one of the major quid pro quos for Israel, because Israel's going to have to get something out of this, and there have to be counter concessions for the Palestinians as well. And here I think he misplayed that one, or he gave it away for free. Unfortunately, I don't think there is going to be progress for the foreseeable future, so better actually to put this one to bed because it's been with us for the last 50 years. Everybody knows that Israel is Jerusalem's capital. There's no secret. And the president was quite open about saying, I'm recognizing Jerusalem, but I'm not prejudging the final status negotiations. So in effect, he didn't really change anything. I think he was, by the way, correct to come down hard on the Palestinians. Now, there's also a need to come down hard on Israel as well to make some concessions. But the fact that it hasn't been done on the Palestinian side, the Palestinians have been maintaining policies for decades which are not acceptable. You can't say no to everything. You can't insist on policies that everyone in the world rejects. The entire international community just about. Certainly the 5 powers, Europe, most of the Arab countries don't accept the Palestinian position as being viable on the right of return. They want something there, but they recognize that it's not going to happen. So yes, there's a need for pressure on the Palestinians here. I think there's a need for pressure on Israel as well. There's this argument, well, this administration isn't even-handed, as if the others were. Israel is a close American ally. The Palestinians are not. Now, either get with it and take positions which will make you a closer American ally, or suffer the consequences. If you repeatedly refuse to come to the table or reject any offer, there are consequences for that. So I hope, actually, I have mixed emotions. I would like very much to see the administration put forward the deal of the century. I'm afraid that we don't have the appropriate people either in Ramallah, Jerusalem, or in Washington. At the moment, I'm convinced that we don't. I don't know what will happen after April 9th. The fact that a two-state solution has not been achieved to date, and that's a fact, doesn't mean it's not the absolutely correct answer. It just means we have to keep working at it. Lots of things haven't happened in history. One state's never going to happen. So let's talk about what we can make happen, think about how to do that, and maybe we can all have a somewhat better future.
Well, there's a plan I think that we can all agree on. So let's thank both of our guests today. Thank you very much. Chuck's book is available in the corner, and I recommend it. It's a good read. And Shibley's posted all over the internet on all kinds of topics, so you can find a lot of what he has read there. So thank you to both of you, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen.